Power doesn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it sits quietly at a dinner table. In September of 1948, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an economy, a culture, a community that had learned through pain how to protect its own. And at the center of it all sat one man, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, before the headlines, before the myths, before Hollywood made him larger than life. Back then, Bumpy wasn't famous. He was trusted. And in Harlem, trust was worth more than money. To understand why, you have to understand Harlem in the 1940s. This was a black metropolis inside a country that still treated black citizens like a problem to be managed, not people to be served. Housing discrimination didn't just shape where people lived. It shaped what they could build. Banks didn't just deny loans, they denied futures. Jobs were available until they weren't. And when the economy tightened, black workers were often the first cut loose. So Harlem did what communities always do when official systems lock them out. It made its own systems, and one of the biggest was the numbers game. To outsiders, the numbers racket looked like gambling, a daily bet on a three-digit number, a chance to turn a little into a lot. But to Harlem, it was something else. It was survival. It was community finance. It was the closest thing many families had to an informal banking system. Cash moving through neighborhoods that mainstream institutions treated like they didn't exist. Historians have written about how the numbers economy functioned as more than a vice. It became a local engine. Money circulated, people got hired, rent got paid, groceries got bought, barbershops, beauty salons, restaurants, tailors. They didn't just sell services, they became nodes in a network. And in a world where legitimate credit was hard to come by, the numbers economy offered something powerful, a sense that tomorrow might be different than today. But there's something else people forget. Before Bumpy Johnson, there was Stephanie St. Claire Stephanie St. Claire was called many things. A numbers queen, a racketeer, a madam of Harlem. And depending on who was writing the headline, those labels were meant to scare you or shame you. But the truth is simpler. She understood structure. She didn't just run numbers. She ran organization. She kept books. She managed collectors. She protected her runners. She enforced rules. And when outsiders tried to muscle their way into Harlem's economy, she didn't ask for mercy. She fought, not with speeches, not with requests, with strategy. She hired legal help. She used the press. She leveraged politics. And when the pressure turned physical, when rival gangs and outside syndicates tried to squeeze her operation, she hired protection. That protection was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't protection in the way people imagine. Not reckless, not loud, not the kind of man who needed to prove something every time he entered a room. He had a reputation for violence, yes. But more than that, he had a reputation for discipline. And discipline is what makes violence useful. In Harlem, he became known as a man who could enforce a boundary without making it chaos. He could make a message stick. And more importantly, he could make it stick without setting the whole neighborhood on fire. That's why, by 1948, when people said Bumpy had influence, what they really meant was, he had consent. Not consent in a legal sense, in a community sense, the kind you can't buy, the kind you can't import, the kind you can only earn by being there, day after day, when the cameras aren't watching. By 1948, Wells' restaurant on 135th Street had become something rare, neutral ground. You could see politicians there, working an angle. You could see cops there, half friendly, half watching. You could see musicians there, talking gigs and dreams and debts. And you could see Harlem's business class too. Quiet men, careful women, people who understood that survival often depends on who you can speak to without raising your voice. Wells was a place where you didn't bring chaos, because chaos would be remembered. And on one particular night, in September of 1948, the room carried that kind of tension you only feel when everyone is pretending things are normal and nobody believes it. The smell of coffee, the clink of cutlery, a laugh that lands a little too sharp, and then the door opens. An emissary from the Italian Mafia walks in. Not alone, but with that posture men wear when they've spent years watching others move out of their way. This wasn't a random visit. This was a message in human form, and the people at Wells understood exactly what it meant. Because the Mafia didn't just want money, they wanted submission. Here's what matters about that moment. By the late 1940s, Italian organized crime had already expanded into many parts of New York's underground economy. They had power, they had political connections, they had enforcement, and they had a strategy that worked in a lot of places: find the local operator, make an example. Take the revenue, but Harlem wasn't a lot of places. Harlem had its own logic, its own memory, its own rules, and it had men who understood that if you let outsiders take the numbers economy, you weren't just losing gambling money. You were losing employment. You were losing influence. You were losing the ability to take care of people the city had already decided not to care about. So when that emissary walked into Wells, the air changed, because everyone knew who the target was: Bumpy Johnson. In the stories people tell, there's always a moment, a line said too loud, a hand placed too casually on a shoulder, a look that dares someone to respond. And the emissary, whether he meant to or not, crossed the line. The insult wasn't just racial, it was strategic. In that world, disrespect wasn't merely personal. It was an invitation to surrender your status or fight to keep it. And everyone in the room knew the script. They expected Bumpy to stand up. They expected him to reach for steel or signal someone else to do it. They expected a scene, because that's what fear-based power always does. It performs, it needs witnesses. But Bumpy didn't perform. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't give the emissary the satisfaction of controlling the room with a single insult. Instead, he reached for silence. Silence is risky because silence leaves space. Space for other people to interpret it as weakness. Space for the aggressor to push further. Space for the room to turn on you if they think you won't protect what you claim. So why would a man like Bumpy choose silence? Because silence can also be a weapon, a pause that says, "I'm deciding what happens next, not you." In the stillness, the room recalibrated. Forks stopped midair. Eyes shifted, careful not to look too interested. The waiter moved like he wanted to disappear. And the emissary, who had walked in expecting fear, felt something else. Something harder to manipulate. Loyalty, not loud loyalty, not performative loyalty. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it's already settled. The emissary realized he wasn't dealing with one man at a table. He was dealing with a whole neighborhood standing behind that man, quietly, collectively, like a wall. Power that depends on fear has to keep moving. It has to keep escalating. Because fear fades, but power that depends on respect, it can wait. Bumpy waited, and in that wait, he forced the emissary to confront a reality he hadn't accounted for. Harlem didn't see Bumpy as a random gangster to be replaced. Harlem saw him as a representative, a buffer, a boundary. A man who, whatever his flaws, understood the rules of the neighborhood and would not let outsiders rewrite them overnight. So instead of reacting, Bumpy did something more dangerous than violence. He made the emissary sit with the consequences. Because in that room, everyone understood something the Mafia often counted on people forgetting. You can kill a man, but you can't intimidate a community that has chosen him. That doesn't mean Harlem was unified in some perfect way. It wasn't. There were divisions, rivalries, personal grudges, competing interests. But there was a shared understanding about one thing. If outsiders take over the neighborhood's economy, the neighborhood loses its ability to take care of itself. And losing that back then could be fatal. So the question that hung in the air wasn't, will Bumpy fight? The real question was, what will it cost to fight him? And more importantly, who else will join? Because the Mafia could bring guns. But Harlem could bring consequences, not just street consequences. Social ones, political ones, economic ones. The kind that turn an easy takeover into a long, expensive war you can't win cleanly. Now, depending on the account you hear, different names appear around this story. But one name that always carries weight in this era is Frank Costello. often described as a major figure in organized crime with deep political connections. And whether Costello was physically present in that room or simply represented by emissaries, the logic associated with his style of power matters here. Costello's reputation, again, in the way people told it, was not built on constant bloodshed. It was built on calculation, on knowing when pressure earns profit and when it creates problems that drain you. Because there's a difference between intimidation and control. Intimidation is fast, control is stable, and stable power doesn't come from picking fights you don't need. If touching Bumpy meant touching all of Harlem, then the cost-benefit analysis changed. Suddenly, this wasn't a simple shakedown. It was an invitation to become the neighborhood's enemy. And enemies in a place like Harlem didn't just show up in alleyways. They showed up in every transaction, every conversation, every door that didn't open when you knocked. So back at Wells' restaurant, the moments stretched. Bumpy's silence wasn't empty, it was filled with certainty, and certainty is contagious. The emissary came in expecting to dominate the room. Instead, he found himself in a room that had already decided what domination would cost. At some point, the emissary had to choose, push further and risk starting something that wouldn't stay contained, or step back and admit, without saying it, that Harlem was not a place you could simply claim, not without consequences. And in the end, he didn't get what he came for, not that night. Because the message he carried, fear travels faster than loyalty, failed the moment it met a community that had already built its own systems to survive. This is where people turn the story into a myth. They want a clean ending, a punchline, a perfect threat, a dramatic gesture, 6 words, a razor, a cinematic one-liner, but focusing on the line misses the point. What happened at Wells wasn't about cleverness. It was about something deeper. It was about legitimacy. The Mafia had power in New York, yes, but Harlem had a form of power the Mafia couldn't manufacture overnight: local trust. That trust didn't make Bumpy a hero. It made him a symbol of something Harlem valued: protection of the neighborhood's autonomy, however imperfect, however compromised, however complicated. And complicated is the right word, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't a saint. He wasn't a civil rights leader. He wasn't a moral lesson wrapped in a nice suit. He was a man shaped by a country that refused to make space for black ambition inside legal systems, then punished people for creating informal ones. And he operated inside that contradiction. So what do we do with that? We tell the truth without turning it into a fairy tale. Harlem's numbers economy helped people survive, and it was still gambling. It circulated money locally, and it still involved coercion. It provided opportunity for some, and it still carried harm for others. That's the reality of underground economies. They grow in the spaces left behind by official neglect. And the people who run them can be both providers and predators, sometimes in the same breath. Bumpy lived in that tension. And that's why the night at Wells mattered, because it showed a kind of power that doesn't rely on shouting. It showed what happens when a community, out of necessity, chooses a figure to stand between them and outside control. Not because he's pure, but because he's theirs. Harlem didn't remember Bumpy simply as a tough man. Harlem remembered him as a man who understood obligation. The unwritten rules, the responsibility that comes with influence. When you hold power in a neighborhood, people don't just watch what you take. They watch what you return. They watch whether you show up when something goes wrong. They watch whether you protect the people who can't protect themselves. And whether all the stories are true or partly true, Harlem passed down a central idea. Bumpy didn't let outsiders treat Harlem like an open register. And in that era, that stance carried weight. Because it told the community something simple: we are not just territory, we are not just revenue, we are people. On that night in 1948, Bumpy Johnson proved something timeless: respect isn't taken. It's earned, one human obligation at a time. And Harlem never forgot. If this story changed how you see power, share it with someone who thinks strength always shouts. Subscribe for more untold American history, where truth matters more than myth. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a room is the silence that refuses to break.